The park was a place I often visited when I needed to clear my head. On that particular evening, the air was cooler than usual, carrying a faint dampness from the recent rain. The gravel beneath my feet crunched rhythmically as I walked the familiar path, the towering trees casting long, wavering shadows in the fading light. I had arrived later than usual, with only a handful of joggers and dog walkers scattered across the vast space. As I followed the looping trail near the edge of the park, where the dense foliage grew wilder, I noticed something out of place. Standing near the base of an old oak tree was a child, no older than 6 or 7. She wore a pale dress that seemed too light for the chilly evening and was barefoot, her tiny toes sunk into the damp earth. At first, I assumed she was waiting for someone, a parent or sibling who had wandered off momentarily, but as I approached, I noticed her stillness. She wasn't crying or calling out, as one might expect from a lost child. Instead, she stood motionless, her face turned downward, her gaze fixed on the ground. A strange unease crept over me, but it was quickly replaced by concern. I slowed my pace, glancing around for any sign of an adult who might belong to her. The clearing was empty, save for the faint rustling of the trees overhead. Compelled by some mix of worry and curiosity, I moved closer. That's when she lifted her head, and for the first time, I saw her eyes. They weren't sad or frightened. They were blank, emotionless pools that seemed far too old for someone so young. I stopped a few feet away, unsure of what to do. Something about her presence felt wrong, though I couldn't place why. "Are you lost?" The question formed in my mind, but I didn't speak it aloud. Instead, I stayed rooted in place, waiting for some sign that she needed help. The child tilted her head slightly, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. Then, she took a small step forward, her bare feet making no sound against the ground. A chill ran down my spine, and I glanced around again, hoping to spot someone else, anyone else, who could confirm what I was seeing. But the park seemed emptier than it had moments ago. It was just me, the trees, and this child who seemed to belong to neither. The silence between us stretched, broken only by the distant rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of an evening bird. Despite the unease gnawing at the edges of my thoughts, I convinced myself to act. A child alone in a park at dusk wasn't something I could ignore. I took a cautious step forward, hoping my presence wouldn't startle her. She didn't move, didn't even flinch, but her gaze shifted upward slightly, enough to give the impression she was watching me through lowered lashes. There was an oddness to the moment, a heaviness in the air that seemed to thicken with every passing second. The path ahead felt longer than it should have, the dim light drawing out the details of the surroundings. Her dress, now more visible, appeared strangely clean for someone wandering alone in the muddy outskirts of the park. It fluttered faintly in the breeze, though no wind touched the trees nearby. As I came closer, I couldn't shake the growing feeling that she was leading me somewhere. It wasn't her movements. She hadn't moved since that first step, but there was a pull, an inexplicable sense that I was being guided, even if indirectly. The rational part of my mind pushed back against these thoughts. She was just a lost child, I reminded myself, and it was up to me to ensure she found her way back to safety. But every instinct told me this wasn't a simple case of a parent momentarily distracted. I finally stopped just a few feet from her. The tension in my chest loosened slightly when I saw her more closely. She looked human enough, just a child with pale skin and dark hair falling across her face. Yet the stillness in her features, the way her limbs seemed too rigid, made her seem less like a person and more like an imitation of one. She didn't speak. Instead, she turned her head slightly to the side, as though waiting for me to make the next move. I gestured toward the main path, hoping to encourage her to follow me toward the park entrance. Her small, bare feet shuffled forward once, then stopped again. Her movements were deliberate but unnatural, her legs bending at sharp, almost mechanical angles. The trees loomed taller, their branches twisting together overhead, blotting out what little light remained. I glanced over my shoulder, the trail behind me now swallowed in shadows. It was then I noticed the sound, or rather, the lack of it. The park had fallen completely silent. No birds, no wind, not even the faint hum of distant traffic. All that remained was the faint padding of her steps, which sounded too close even when she hadn't moved. Every nerve in my body screamed to turn back, but I couldn't. My focus locked onto her, as though some unseen force demanded I keep going. As we moved deeper into the park, the world around me felt increasingly disconnected, as though I had crossed into some isolated pocket of existence. The path beneath my feet was damp, each step muffled and uneven, yet her bare feet made no sound at all. The child walked ahead now, her pace slow but deliberate, as if she knew exactly where she was going. I followed out of obligation or perhaps curiosity, though I couldn't shake the growing weight of unease pressing against my chest. The trees closed in tighter on either side of the trail, their branches interlocking above like skeletal hands. Shadows stretched longer and darker, seeming to twist and ripple even when I stood still. It felt as though the park itself were alive, subtly shifting to obscure the way back. I noticed her movements more closely. They were wrong, unnatural in a way I struggled to describe. Her arms hung stiffly at her sides, and when she turned a corner, her head moved first, almost disjointedly, before her body followed. Then came the sound, faint at first, like a whisper carried on the wind. I froze, straining to identify it, but it vanished as quickly as it had come. I scanned the path ahead, half expecting to see her waiting for me. Instead, she was further along, standing at the edge of a cluster of trees that loomed like sentinels. The air grew colder, enough to seep through my jacket and prickle my skin. I clenched my hands, forcing myself to keep moving. Each step forward felt heavier than the last, as though the ground were subtly dragging me down. As I approached her, I became aware of subtle, inexplicable details. Her dress no longer appeared pristine. Dirt and dark stains now streaked the fabric, though I hadn't seen her touch the ground. Her hair, too, seemed longer than before, trailing over her shoulders in uneven strands that swayed even when the air was still. And then there were the whispers again. This time, they were louder, clearer. They weren't words exactly, just disjointed syllables forming patterns that teased the edge of recognition. They seemed to emanate from the trees themselves, wrapping around me like an invisible net. I stopped abruptly, realizing I had been staring at her feet. They hadn't moved in minutes, yet she was somehow further ahead each time I looked. A surge of dread gripped me as I glanced back, only to find the path behind completely shrouded in darkness. It dawned on me that the park no longer felt like a familiar place. The trail, the trees, even the air. It all seemed alien, as though I had stumbled into a fragment of some other reality. And yet, I couldn't leave. The child turned to face me then, her head tilting in that unnatural, almost mechanical way. Her eyes, still devoid of expression, seemed to lock onto mine with a force that rooted me in place. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so profound it rang in my ears. I wanted to run, but something held me there, as if the act of turning away would only make things worse. The stillness pressed against me, heavy and suffocating, as if the very air around us had solidified. Her gaze bore into me, unblinking, unrelenting. In that moment, I realized I wasn't simply looking at her. I was being studied, measured. I shifted uneasily, attempting to gather my thoughts. The park, now completely devoid of any sound or movement, felt infinite, as though the boundaries I had known had dissolved. My mind scrambled for an explanation, clinging desperately to rationality, but nothing seemed to fit. She moved again, this time stepping closer, the faint sound of her feet finally breaking the suffocating quiet. I couldn't look away, drawn by some invisible thread connecting us. My legs felt like lead, incapable of retreat, even as every instinct screamed for me to flee. When she stopped just a few feet away, I noticed for the first time the faint, almost imperceptible marks on her skin. Thin lines etched across her arms and neck, like old scars or scratches, winding in patterns too deliberate to be accidental. They pulsed faintly, as if alive, glowing dimly in the gathering darkness. And then she spoke, not with words, but in a voice that seemed to bypass sound altogether, resonating directly in my mind. It wasn't a language I recognized, but the meaning was clear, carried on waves of raw emotion and imagery. I saw flashes of something ancient and unknowable, a presence that had existed long before the park, long before anything I could comprehend. The images came faster, overwhelming my senses. The towering trees, the endless paths, and a figure standing alone in the heart of it all, waiting. Her voice grew louder, more insistent, flooding my thoughts with fragments of my own life. Memories I hadn't thought of in years, details so precise they felt intrusive. Somehow, she knew me, down to the smallest, most insignificant details. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't a child. It had never been a child. Whatever stood before me wore the form of one, but it was a disguise, a facade designed to lure me deeper into this isolated, suffocating corner of the world. I tried to step back, to break the invisible pull keeping me rooted, but my body refused to respond. My heart raced as the glowing lines on her skin brightened, casting eerie patterns onto the ground around us. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The light dimmed, and the silence returned. She turned away, her movements fluid and purposeful now, and began walking once more, deeper into the trees. I stood frozen, torn between the compulsion to follow and the desperate need to escape. My mind churned, screaming at me to leave, but my feet remained planted as her small figure disappeared into the shadows. It felt as though she had taken something from me, something intangible but vital, and yet I couldn't let myself look away. The moment she disappeared into the shadows, the spell seemed to break. My legs, heavy and stiff only seconds before, suddenly sprang into motion. Without a second thought, I turned and ran, the cold air biting against my skin as I fled the suffocating stillness that had enveloped the park. The path beneath me twisted unnaturally, the familiar route now unfamiliar and fragmented. Trees leaned closer, their branches clawing at the edges of my vision, casting warped and jagged shadows across the trail. I stumbled once, catching myself just before hitting the damp ground, and forced myself to keep moving. Behind me, the silence fractured. Soft footsteps, too light to belong to me, padded rhythmically in the darkness. I didn't dare look back, but their presence was undeniable. They were deliberate, unhurried, as though whoever, or whatever, was following me had no need to rush. My breath came in shallow gasps as I pushed forward, my mind racing to remember the layout of the park. I needed to reach the entrance, the safety of the open streets beyond, but the path seemed endless, stretching on far longer than it should have. The air grew colder with each step, a biting chill that seemed to seep into my bones. My ears buzzed with an unnatural hum, like the faint vibration of static electricity, growing louder with every passing second. The world around me felt wrong, distorted in ways I couldn't fully comprehend. Ahead, I saw a break in the trees, a sliver of open sky beyond the canopy. Relief surged through me, but it was fleeting. The footsteps behind me grew louder, closer, accompanied now by that faint, familiar whispering. I quickened my pace, adrenaline overriding the exhaustion in my limbs. The clearing came into view, and with it, the faint glow of a street lamp in the distance. It was so close. Just a few more steps, a few more moments of effort, and I would be free. The whispers swelled, overlapping and chaotic, as though dozens of voices were speaking at once. They filled my mind, drowning out my thoughts, but I didn't stop. I burst into the clearing, the dim light of the street lamp spilling over me like a lifeline. As soon as I crossed into the open, the sounds ceased. The chill lifted, and the oppressive weight that had clung to me vanished. I turned instinctively, my chest heaving, but the path behind me was empty. The trees stood motionless, their gnarled branches swaying gently in the breeze. The child was gone. The whispers, the footsteps, everything had disappeared as if it had never existed. But the stillness of the park felt wrong, unnatural in a way I couldn't explain. I staggered toward the street lamp, my legs trembling beneath me, and collapsed onto a nearby bench. My pulse thundered in my ears, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. Yet, even in the safety of the light, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't truly alone. The park loomed behind me, an imposing shadow against the faint glow of the streetlights. I sat motionless on the bench, trying to steady my breathing, my hands trembling despite the warmth of the night. My mind replayed the events in fragments. The child's blank eyes, the whispers, the oppressive cold. It all felt too vivid to dismiss as a trick of the imagination. As I stared back at the darkened entrance of the park, I noticed subtle movements at the edge of the trees. Shadows shifted unnaturally, curling and stretching, as though the branches themselves were alive. My heart sank when I thought I saw a small figure standing just beyond the tree line. But when I blinked, it was gone. In the days that followed, the sense of unease lingered. I avoided the park entirely, taking different routes to work, even though it added time to my commute. Despite my efforts, the feeling of being watched persisted. At first, it was subtle, an occasional flicker in my peripheral vision or a faint sound that I couldn't quite place. But soon, it escalated. At night, I would wake suddenly, convinced someone was in the room with me. Shadows danced unnaturally across the walls, and I swore I heard faint whispers, too low to make out but unmistakably there. Every time I looked, the room was empty, yet the air felt heavier, charged with something I couldn't explain. Desperate for answers, I scoured local news archives and online forums for anything unusual about the park. To my surprise, I found scattered reports of similar incidents, people claiming to have seen a child wandering alone, only to experience strange phenomena afterward. Some described feelings of dread and paranoia. Others mentioned sightings of the child in unexpected places, even long after leaving the park. One post stood out, written by someone who claimed to have encountered the same figure years ago. They spoke of fleeting glimpses and reflections, faint footsteps that followed them wherever they went, and the gradual unraveling of their sense of reality. The post ended abruptly, with no updates or explanations. I began to notice the same patterns. Reflections in windows showed faint outlines that shouldn't have been there. My footsteps echoed unevenly, as though someone else were walking just behind me. Even in crowded spaces, I felt isolated, as if the world around me had become a thin veil separating me from something far darker. The child appeared again one night, not in the park, but at the edge of my vision as I crossed a quiet street. Her pale dress was unmistakable, glowing faintly in the dim light. I froze, my pulse racing, but when I turned fully to face her, she was gone. I don't know what she is or what she wants, but I can feel her presence growing stronger. She isn't bound to the park. I understand that now. Wherever I go, she's there, waiting, watching. I've stopped trying to escape. There's no point. Whatever followed me out of that park, it's no longer just following. It's here, with me, always. I never thought I'd find myself driving back to Springfield, the town I'd left behind the day I turned 18. My name is Adam Walker, and I'm 34 now, living a life far removed from those quiet, uneventful years. Springfield was the kind of place you didn't miss when you left. It was small, unremarkable, the sort of town that seemed permanently stuck in a time when nothing interesting ever happened. Maybe that's why I left without looking back. The email came on a Wednesday night, as I was wrapping up a long day at work. Its subject line read, "Springfield High Reunion, this Friday." I nearly deleted it, assuming it was junk, but the details stopped me. My name was in the body of the message, alongside the exact years I'd attended Springfield High. The email seemed genuine, though it was odd to announce a reunion with only 2 days' notice. I tried to recall if I'd ever heard of such short planning for these events, but nothing came to mind. Curiosity got the better of me. Nostalgia, perhaps, or some faint sense of obligation. Against my better judgment, I replied to the email, confirming my attendance. The response came immediately. "We're so excited to see you, Adam." There was no signature, no name to attach to the message, just an address and the time. 7 p.m. at a banquet hall I didn't remember existing. As Friday approached, I felt a growing unease I couldn't quite explain. The drive to Springfield was long, and the town looked much the same as I remembered. The same weathered houses, the same sagging diner sign, the same sense of stagnation hanging in the air. Yet, something felt different, as though the entire place had been preserved just for me, like a diorama waiting for its centerpiece. The banquet hall was on the outskirts of town, in an area that didn't look familiar. It was a modest building, with a brick facade and dim, yellowed lights glowing in the windows. The parking lot was full of cars, mostly older models that might have belonged to the parents of my classmates. I pulled into an empty spot near the back and sat for a moment, debating whether to leave. But something held me there. A tug, faint but insistent, as though I'd been expected for much longer than I realized. I stepped inside, and the atmosphere shifted immediately. The air was thick and warm, carrying a faint metallic tang that I couldn't place. The hall was decorated in blue and gold, our school colors, with balloons, streamers, and long tables draped in white cloth. It looked like any generic reunion, but there was something about it I couldn't quite put my finger on. Then I saw the faces. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual. The crowd looked familiar, filled with people I hadn't seen in years. But as I moved deeper into the room, the strangeness became undeniable. They hadn't aged. It wasn't just that they looked good for their age. They looked exactly the same as they had when we were teenagers. Mark, the star of the basketball team, still had the same buzz cut and towering build. Emily, the quiet girl from biology, wore the same floral dress I remembered from prom night. Even their expressions were the same, like a photograph come to life. Something cold settled in my chest, but I forced myself to smile and mingle. Hands were shaken, old memories dredged up with alarming precision. They all seemed thrilled to see me, their enthusiasm too perfect, too rehearsed. I found a seat near the back, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The conversation and laughter around me felt distant, like background noise from a television in another room. My unease grew with every passing moment, a slow, steady drumbeat I couldn't ignore. And yet, I stayed. Sitting at the back of the room, I tried to settle my nerves by observing the crowd. The decorations, though festive, had an artificial quality, too perfect, as though someone had followed a manual on how to plan a reunion without understanding the sentiment behind it. Balloons floated stiffly, the streamers hung in symmetrical patterns, and the tables were arranged with mechanical precision. It all felt clinical, like a set piece in a play where I didn't know my lines. I turned my attention to the people. Their faces were frozen in time, untouched by the years. The details nagged at me. Emily's dress, the same shade and pattern I remembered. Mark's identical buzz cut. Even the slight smudge of eyeliner on Sarah's cheek, just as it had been during our senior year photos. These weren't just familiar faces. They were perfect replicas of the past. The realization crawled under my skin. How could it be possible? I tried to convince myself it was some elaborate coincidence, but the unease persisted. Every conversation felt practiced, their words flowing too smoothly, their laughs arriving on cue. It was like they were actors playing roles they didn't fully understand. The food provided little comfort. Platters of sandwiches, salads, and pasta filled the tables, arranged to look appetizing. But when I took a bite, it was flavorless, almost textureless, like something that had been created to look like food without being real. I pushed my plate aside, suddenly nauseated. The music was familiar, a playlist of hits from our high school years. At first, it felt nostalgic, but soon I noticed the same songs looping in the same order. It wasn't just repetitive, it was exact. The pauses, the transitions, even the subtle crackles in the audio repeated, as if someone had pressed rewind on the same short recording. I stood, deciding to take a walk and clear my head. The heavy atmosphere and the oppressive warmth of the hall felt suffocating. I wandered toward the edges of the room, past the clusters of attendees who seemed too engaged in their perfect conversations to notice me. That's when I noticed the windows. They should have looked out onto the parking lot, the quiet streets, the night sky. Instead, they were black, not covered by curtains or blinds, but solidly, unnaturally black, as if they had been painted over or replaced with slabs of obsidian. I pressed my hand against one, but it was cold and unyielding, like stone. No light escaped, no reflection returned. The air around me grew heavier. My breaths came shallow, my pulse quickening with each step. When I reached for my phone, hoping to distract myself or find some rational explanation, I discovered there was no signal. The screen displayed a hollow, searching icon. I checked for Wi-Fi, nothing. Returning to my seat felt like retreating into enemy territory. The conversations around me continued uninterrupted, but their cadence no longer seemed natural. There was an unnatural rhythm to it, like the ticking of a metronome. Every laugh, every gesture felt calculated, as if it were part of a larger pattern I couldn't comprehend. My thoughts raced, searching for an explanation, but none came. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was an intruder, out of place in a gathering I no longer understood. And yet, I stayed. The sense of unease clawed at me as I sat among the faces I should have recognized. The growing dissonance between my surroundings and the lingering memories of my past filled every corner of my mind. I needed a moment to compose myself, to breathe air that didn't feel suffocating. Rising from my seat, I mumbled something about needing the restroom and made my way toward the back of the hall. As I walked, the air seemed to grow heavier, more tangible, like walking through a dense fog I couldn't see. The light in the hallway was dimmer than the banquet hall, casting long shadows that shifted imperceptibly as I moved. I passed closed doors with no signs or labels, their surfaces spotless, almost polished. When I finally reached the restroom, I found it empty. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my own breathing. The water from the faucet ran colder than expected as I splashed it onto my face, trying to shake the growing dread. I looked at myself in the mirror, my reflection distorted slightly by the faint ripples in the glass, and tried to convince myself it was all in my head. But it wasn't. On my way back, I decided to take a closer look at the building. I walked toward what I thought were exit doors, hoping to step outside for fresh air. The closer I got, the more my steps faltered. The doors didn't look right. They seemed out of place, slightly smaller than they should have been, their frames strangely misaligned. When I reached for the handle, my fingers met a surface that wasn't metal or wood but something colder and smoother. The door didn't budge. I pushed harder, then tried the other door, but neither moved. It was as though they had been welded shut, or were never meant to open. I turned back toward the main hall, my pulse pounding in my ears. The blacked-out windows I'd noticed earlier now seemed more sinister, their impenetrable darkness a deliberate design rather than a forgotten detail. There was no escape, no sense of time or place, only the growing realization that I was completely isolated. I checked my phone again, desperate for any connection to the outside world. The screen remained blank, mocking me with its absence of signal. It felt heavier in my hand, as though it, too, was succumbing to the strange gravity of this place. I returned to the hall, hoping that mingling with the crowd might ease my growing paranoia. But the room had changed in my absence, subtly at first. The chatter was quieter now, though the same music continued its relentless loop. The movements of the guests seemed slower, their interactions less animated. It was as if they were conserving energy for something. I took my seat again, feeling their eyes on me even when I wasn't looking. The conversations around me buzzed with a shallow energy, lacking the natural ebb and flow of real human interaction. They were placeholders, mechanical and cold, their purpose unclear but undeniably wrong. It was then that I began to realize I wasn't part of this. Whatever this was, it didn't include me. The room felt different now. The once muted laughter and casual chatter had grown quieter, replaced by a suffocating stillness. My unease had transformed into full-blown dread, but I couldn't leave. There was no way out. I sat stiffly at my table, watching the guests with growing suspicion. Their movements, once passably natural, now seemed wrong in a way I couldn't explain. A strange rhythm had overtaken the room, their gestures and glances synchronized as though guided by some unseen force. It wasn't until I looked closer that I noticed how they were all subtly turning toward me. At first, it was just a few faces, their heads tilting slightly in my direction as they whispered to one another. Then, as if responding to some silent command, the rest of the room joined them. A wave of slow, deliberate movement spread through the crowd, and soon every face was pointed at me. I froze, my body paralyzed with fear. The murmurs grew louder, their words indistinct but filled with a sinister undertone that made my skin crawl. It was no longer a reunion. It was a performance, and I was the unwilling centerpiece. Jessica was the first to approach. She had been in my calculus class, a quiet girl who rarely spoke. Now, she moved with an unnatural grace, her steps deliberate, her gaze locked on me. Her smile, once shy and warm, was stretched too wide, her teeth gleaming under the dim lights. "You took your time," she said, her voice soft but cutting, as if the words carried more weight than they should have. I wanted to respond, but my throat felt constricted, my voice trapped by the oppressive atmosphere. She stood too close, her presence invasive, her smile unwavering. The others began to close in, their movements fluid and synchronized, forming a loose circle around my table. I could feel their stares drilling into me, stripping away any illusion of safety I might have clung to. I stood abruptly, my chair screeching against the floor. The sound cut through the silence, but it didn't faze them. Jessica tilted her head, her expression curious, as though she were studying a rare specimen. "You shouldn't have left," she said, her tone light but laced with accusation. The words sent a chill down my spine. I took a step back, my mind racing, but they didn't follow. They just stood there, watching, waiting. I turned and bolted toward the nearest hallway, desperate to escape their oppressive gazes. The air grew heavier with every step, and the sound of my own breathing echoed unnaturally around me. I didn't dare look back. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, the same doors and blank walls repeating over and over. My footsteps faltered as I realized I wasn't getting anywhere. Panic gripped me, and I stumbled, catching myself against one of the doors. When I looked up, I saw them. They stood at the end of the hallway, their faces barely visible in the dim light. Jessica was at the front, her head tilted at that same unnatural angle, her smile never wavering. They didn't move toward me. They didn't need to. The hallway seemed to shrink around me, the walls closing in, the air suffocating. I turned and ran in the opposite direction, my legs trembling beneath me. All I could think about was getting away, finding a way out of this impossible nightmare. But deep down, I knew there was no escape. I ran blindly, my lungs burning and my legs threatening to give out. The hallway seemed endless, looping back on itself no matter which direction I turned. My mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of this surreal nightmare, but nothing made sense. Eventually, I stumbled into a doorway that hadn't been there before. It was slightly ajar, and beyond it was a stairwell that spiraled downward into darkness. I hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside, desperate to escape the relentless presence of those who had surrounded me. The stairs felt wrong beneath my feet, each step uneven and cold, as if they weren't made for human use. The air grew colder with every descent, carrying a faint metallic smell that reminded me of rust or blood. The darkness below seemed alive, swallowing the faint light from above. At the bottom of the staircase, I found myself in a cavernous space. The walls were rough, almost organic, pulsating faintly as though they were breathing. The floor was uneven, strewn with debris that crunched beneath my shoes. In the center of the room stood a tall, ancient mirror, its surface cracked and tarnished. As I approached the mirror, a feeling of dread settled over me. The glass didn't reflect the room around it. Instead, it showed something else entirely. The scene in the mirror was familiar. The banquet hall, brightly lit, filled with the same people I had seen earlier. But they weren't milling about or chatting anymore. They were standing perfectly still, arranged in a precise circle. In the center of the circle was me. I watched as the version of myself in the mirror turned, his face pale and eyes wide with terror. He reached out, pressing his hands against the inside of the glass as though trapped behind it. His mouth moved, silently begging, screaming for help. Then the others in the mirror began to move. Their faces, once familiar, twisted into grotesque parodies of human expressions. Their smiles stretched impossibly wide, their eyes hollow and black. They closed in on the version of me in the mirror, their movements jerky and unnatural. I stumbled back, unable to tear my gaze away from the mirror. The figure in the glass, the other me, was consumed by the encroaching crowd, his face disappearing behind a wall of contorted figures. The mirror cracked further, spiderweb fractures spreading across its surface, But it didn't shatter. The air grew heavy, suffocating, as if the room itself were closing in on me. I turned, desperate to escape, only to find the stairwell had disappeared. In its place stood Jessica, her body silhouetted against the faint glow of the pulsating walls. Her smile was no longer human. It split her face unnaturally, revealing rows of sharp, gleaming teeth. Her eyes glowed faintly, 2 pinpoints of light in the darkness. She stepped closer, her movements fluid and predatory. "You were always meant to return," she said, her voice echoing as though coming from all around me. I backed away, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The others began to emerge from the darkness, their forms distorted, their faces frozen in grotesque mockeries of the people I'd once known. It was then I realized the truth. This wasn't just a reunion. It was a trap. The invitation, the hall, the faces frozen in time. It had all been crafted to lure me back, to pull me into whatever this place was. The mirror began to glow faintly, its cracks pulsing with light. The figures turned toward it, as if drawn by its energy. I felt the pull, too, an overwhelming force dragging me toward the fractured glass. I resisted, clawing at the ground, but it was futile. The closer I got to the mirror, the more I could see myself reflected in its broken surface, not as I was, but as I would become. My face twisted, my body warped, my humanity stripped away. And then, the glass shattered. The sound of the mirror shattering wasn't sharp like I'd expected. It was dull, muffled, like a heartbeat stopping mid-thump. For a moment, everything was still. The pulsating walls, the grotesque figures, even the cold air. They all froze, suspended in a silence so profound it seemed to press against my chest. And then, the room shifted. It was subtle at first, a barely perceptible tilt, like the ground beneath me was adjusting itself. But soon, the entire space began to ripple, as if it were made of liquid. The fragments of the shattered mirror didn't fall. They floated, suspended in the air, each shard catching and distorting the faint light. I wanted to move, to run, but my body refused to respond. My limbs felt leaden, as if they were no longer entirely mine. I could only watch as the fragments began to rearrange themselves, spinning slowly, forming a new surface. When the mirror was whole again, it no longer reflected the cavernous room or the figures within it. Instead, it showed me, not just my face, but my entire life, playing out in fragmented images that flickered across the surface. Moments from my childhood, my awkward teenage years, my decision to leave Springfield. They all unfolded in rapid succession. The reflections began to slow, settling on a single scene. Me, sitting at my desk at work, staring blankly at my computer screen. I looked drained, tired, a version of myself I barely recognized. I wanted to look away, but the mirror wouldn't let me. The figures around me began to stir again, their movements synchronized as they turned toward the mirror. Jessica stepped forward, her distorted smile widening impossibly. "You see it now, don't you?" she said, her voice low and guttural, resonating within the walls of the room. I didn't respond. I couldn't. But deep down, I understood what she meant. The mirror wasn't just showing me my past. It was offering a choice. The shards began to shimmer, their edges glowing faintly as they hovered in the air. I felt a pull, stronger than anything I'd experienced before. It wasn't just physical. It was emotional, spiritual, as if the mirror was calling me to step inside, to become part of the distorted reality it represented. The others began to close in again, their forms shifting, melting into one another until they became a single mass of writhing shapes. Their voices merged into a low hum, rising and falling like a chant, urging me toward the mirror. I fought against it, my mind screaming in protest even as my body betrayed me. My feet dragged forward, each step heavier than the last. The glowing surface of the mirror seemed to expand, filling my vision, erasing everything else. And then, just as my hand touched the glass, I felt it, a sharp, searing pain that shot through my entire body. It wasn't just physical. It was as if my very essence were being torn apart, reshaped into something unrecognizable. The last thing I saw before the mirror consumed me was my own face, twisted and broken, staring back at me with hollow eyes. When I woke, I was standing in the banquet hall again. The decorations, the faces, the music, they were all exactly as they'd been when I first arrived. But now, I understood. I wasn't me anymore. I looked down at my hands, pale and unfamiliar. I caught my reflection in one of the dark windows, but it wasn't my face staring back. It was someone else's, someone younger, unblemished by time. The others smiled at me, their expressions warm, welcoming, as if I'd finally joined them. And maybe I had. The hall doors opened, and another guest stepped inside, looking confused and slightly nervous. The group turned toward them, their movements perfectly synchronized. I smiled too, the same wide, unnatural grin I'd seen on Jessica's face. It was time to welcome the next guest.